Retired pilot Frank Morrison sat in his garage listening to his old aviation radio when he heard the trembling voice of a young pilot. Nobody believed him until 15 military helicopters landed at the airport. The general shouted through a megaphone, "Where is Colonel Morrison?" Frank Morrison, 76 years old, lived in the outskirts of Colorado Springs in a modest ranch house that had seen better days. The paint was peeling slightly around the window frames, and the garden showed signs of a man who spent more time looking up at the sky than down at the soil. But it was his garage that told the real story of his life. The garage resembled an old aircraft cockpit more than a place to park cars. Aeronautical charts from decades past covered every inch of the walls, their edges yellowed and corners curled from years of reference. His old flight helmet sat on a dusty shelf, next to leather-bound logbooks filled with thousands of hours of flight time. In the corner, almost like a shrine, sat his 1982 aviation radio, a Bendix King KX-170B that had served him faithfully through his final years of active duty. Every morning at precisely 0700 hours, old military habits die hard, Frank would shuffle to the garage in his worn slippers, carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. He'd settle into the old folding chair he'd positioned just right, flip the radio's power switch, and listen to the dance of air traffic around Denver International Airport. It wasn't just habit anymore. It was longing, a connection to the world he'd left behind but never stopped loving. That particular Tuesday morning started like any other. October had painted Colorado in brilliant golds and reds, and the crisp air carried the promise of winter. Frank adjusted the radio's frequency to 124.35, Denver approach control, and settled back to listen to the familiar symphony of pilots checking in, controllers issuing vectors, and the steady hum of aviation commerce. His coffee was still hot when everything changed. The voice that suddenly filled the frequency was young, strained, and carrying the unmistakable edge of barely controlled panic. "Denver Control, United 447, we have an emergency. Complete hydraulic failure, backup system not responding. Repeat, total hydraulic loss." Frank's weathered hands tightened around his coffee mug. That voice, the quaver, the rising pitch, the controlled desperation, it was exactly like the voices of the young pilots he'd trained 4 decades ago when they faced their first real emergency. He set his coffee down with deliberate care and leaned closer to the radio. United Airlines Flight 447 had departed Denver for Chicago O'Hare at 0645 with 186 passengers and crew aboard. Captain James Carter, 32 years old and a pilot for 8 years, had been having a routine morning until the master caution alarm began screaming in the cockpit. The hydraulic pressure gauges were reading 0 across the board, a nightmare scenario that meant the aircraft's primary and backup flight control systems had failed. In the Denver Terminal Radar Approach Control Facility, 28-year-old Jessica Williams stared at her radar screen with wide eyes. She'd been an air traffic controller for exactly 2 years, 4 months and 16 days. She'd handled weather delays, minor mechanical issues, and the occasional unruly pilot, but nothing like this. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her emergency procedures manual. "United 447, Roger, your emergency," she transmitted, trying to keep her voice steady. "Squawk 7,700, say souls on board and fuel remaining." "Denver, we're squawking emergency. 186 souls on board, fuel for 2 hours. We're having trouble maintaining control. The aircraft wants to roll right and dive." Jessica flipped through her manual with increasing desperation. The procedures seemed inadequate for what she was hearing in the pilot's voice. "United 447, stand by. Implement emergency hydraulic procedures per your checklist." "Denver, we've run the checklist 3 times. Nothing's working. Manual reversion isn't giving us enough control authority. We need help. Frank couldn't stand it anymore. He'd listened to that same desperation too many times, had felt it himself when he was a young pilot facing the impossible. His hands moved almost without conscious thought, switching his old CB radio to the emergency frequency and adjusting the antenna. United 447, this is Colonel Frank Morrison, United States Air Force retired. I've experienced this exact malfunction in a KC-135 Stratotanker in 1982. If you're willing to listen, I can talk you through this. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then Jessica's voice exploded over the frequency, sharp with authority and anger. Unknown station, this is Denver Control. You are making unauthorized transmissions on an emergency frequency. Cease immediately or you will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Frank's response was calm, measured, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had commanded respect for 40 years. Control, there are 186 lives aboard that aircraft. I've survived this type of hydraulic failure 3 times in military service. Your standard procedures won't work. I know because I helped write some of them. Security, Jessica shouted to her supervisor. We have someone jamming 122.75! Find them and shut them down now. But Captain Carter, wrestling with 80 tons of barely controllable aircraft at 25,000 feet, was listening to something else entirely. The voice of someone who sounded like he knew what he was talking about. The standard procedures weren't working. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, and he could feel it wanting to enter an unrecoverable dive. Sir, whoever you are, I'm listening, Carter transmitted, his voice tight with concentration. Frank's voice came through clear and steady, carrying decades of hard-won experience. Captain, first thing, reduce your left engine to 70% power. Keep your right engine at 40%. This will give you some manual control through differential thrust. Do it now. But that's not in any procedure I know. Son, I've been flying since before you were born. Trust me on this one. Jessica was now shouting at her supervisor, Robert Hayes, who had come running when he heard the commotion. Some crazy old man has hijacked our frequency. He's giving unauthorized instructions to an aircraft in distress. Hayes, a 20-year veteran of air traffic control, was already on the phone with airport security. Find this guy and arrest him. This is a federal crime. But in the cockpit of United 447, something remarkable was happening. Carter had followed Frank's instruction, and for the first time since the emergency began, he felt like he had some measure of control over his aircraft. It's working. Carter's voice carried a note of amazement. I can actually feel the difference. Frank continued, his voice never wavering. Good. Now you're going to need to manually extend your landing gear. Your hydraulic pumps are dead, so you'll need to use the emergency hand crank. It's located behind the first officer's seat. You'll need to turn it exactly 47 times. No more, no less. 47 times. Are you sure about that, sir? Son, I was on the engineering team that designed the backup systems for the 737-800 series, back in 1994. 47 cranks will fully extend and lock your gear. I'd stake my life on it. And right now I'm staking yours. 15 miles away at Peterson Air Force Base, Staff Sergeant Michael Miller was monitoring civilian radio frequencies as part of routine intelligence gathering when he heard something that made him sit up straight. Someone on the civilian emergency frequency was using precise military terminology and referencing classified aircraft systems information. Miller immediately called his supervisor. Sir, we have someone on civilian emergency frequency using military protocols and discussing classified aircraft specifications. The call went up the chain of command with military efficiency, finally reaching the desk of Brigadier General Thomas Burke. At 58, Burke had spent 34 years in the Air Force and had heard every kind of security breach imaginable. But when Miller mentioned the name Colonel Frank Morrison, Burke's entire demeanor changed. "Did you say Frank Morrison?" Tall guy, silver hair, probably sounds like he's giving orders even when he's asking for coffee. "I don't know what he looks like, sir, but he definitely sounds like he's used to being in command." Burke's face went pale. Frank Morrison wasn't just any retired colonel, he was a legend. In 1982, he'd landed a KC-135 tanker with complete hydraulic failure, saving 50 Air Force personnel. In 1991, during the Gulf War, he'd brought down a cargo plane with both engines shot out, saving 200 soldiers. The man had more decorations than most generals and had trained half the pilots currently flying for major airlines. "Sergeant, I want 15 helicopters ready for immediate deployment to Denver International Airport. Full escort formation." "Sir, may I ask why?" "Because if Colonel Frank Morrison is talking, everyone better damn well be listening. Move." While the military mobilized, Frank continued his patient instruction of Captain Carter. "You're going to approach on runway 35L. Your descent rate will be higher than normal because you can't use your flaps effectively. Plan for 180 knots on final approach. That's faster than you like, but it's what you need for control." Jessica had become increasingly frantic. Airport security should have found this lunatic by now. "He's putting everyone at risk." Frank's response was measured and patient. "Young lady, I understand you're trying to do your job, but right now your job is to help save those 186 people, not to follow procedure manuals that weren't written for this situation. Don't lecture me about my job. I've been trained for this." Have you ever talked down an aircraft with total hydraulic failure? Well, no, but I have. 3 times, and I've trained over 1,300 pilots in emergency procedures. Sometimes, experience trumps the manual. Captain Carter's voice interrupted their exchange. "Colonel Morrison, we're beginning our descent. The aircraft is responding to your power settings, but it's like wrestling a bear." "That's normal, son. The aircraft wants to do what physics tells it to do, not what you tell it to do. Use small inputs. Think of it like you're steering a boat, not a car. Anticipate what it wants to do and use engine power to guide it where you want to go." Meanwhile, Frank's quiet neighborhood was about to become very unquiet. 3 police cars had surrounded his house, and officers Dave Johnson and Maria Santos were approaching his garage with handcuffs ready. 500 feet, Carter announced, his voice tight with concentration. "Good. Power back to 65% on the left, 35% on the right. You're going to hit hard, but you're going to hit straight," Frank coached. 400 feet. "Denver, the runway looks good." Jessica, despite her anger at Frank, found herself holding her breath. On her radar screen, United 447 was approaching the runway at an angle and speed that should have been impossible to survive. 300 feet. "Colonel, I can see the runway clearly." "Perfect. When you feel the mains touch, cut all power immediately and apply brakes gradually. Don't try to stop quickly. Let the aircraft settle first." In the garage, Officer Johnson was placing handcuffs on Frank's wrists. "Sir, you're under arrest for interfering with air traffic control and endangering public safety." Frank submitted calmly. "Officers, I understand you have a job to do, but you might want to wait a moment." His radio crackled. 200 feet. "Here we go. Everyone in the garage." Frank, the 2 officers, even a neighbor who had wandered over froze and listened. 100 feet. 50. Contact. The sound of screeching tires and screaming brakes filled the radio. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Denver Control, United 447 is on the ground and safe. All souls aboard unharmed. A cheer erupted from the radio. You could hear it in the background from the control tower. Captain Carter's voice came through, shaky with relief and exhaustion. Colonel Morrison, sir, wherever you are. 186 people owe you their lives. Officer Johnson looked at Frank with new eyes. Sir, exactly who are you? Before Frank could answer, a sound filled the sky that made everyone look up. 15 military helicopters in perfect formation were approaching, their rotors creating a thunderous symphony. They landed with precision in the airport's parking lots, on unused taxiways, anywhere they could find space. General Burke stepped from the lead helicopter, his uniform crisp despite the urgency of the flight. He carried a megaphone and his voice boomed across the airport. This is Brigadier General Thomas Burke, United States Air Force. I need to speak with Colonel Frank Morrison immediately. In the control tower, Jessica's face had gone white. Colonel, did he say Colonel? The airport police had Frank in custody and were leading him toward their patrol car when Burke's voice echoed across the facility. Officer Johnson's radio crackled to life. All units release the individual you have in custody immediately. That is a direct order from General Burke. Johnson looked at his radio, then at Frank. Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. 10 minutes later, Frank stood in the main terminal as General Burke approached with 30 Air Force personnel in formation behind him. Burke stopped 3 feet away and rendered a perfect military salute. Every airman behind him snapped to attention and saluted simultaneously. Colonel Morrison, once again you've saved lives, sir. Frank returned the salute with the crisp precision of a career military officer. Just doing what needed to be done, General. Burke turned to address Jessica, who had come down from the control tower and was standing nearby looking like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Miss Williams, let me introduce you properly. Colonel Frank Morrison served our country for 40 years. He's trained over 1,300 pilots, saved more than 500 lives in emergency situations, and is the recipient of the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and 3 Silver Stars. The man you just spent the last hour trying to silence is a living legend in American aviation. Jessica's knees felt weak. I had no idea. Frank approached her with gentle eyes. You couldn't have known, Miss Williams, but you also chose not to listen. Experience often comes with gray hair and a quiet voice. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is stop talking and start listening. Captain Carter had made his way from the aircraft to the terminal, still in his uniform but looking exhausted from the ordeal. When he saw Frank, he walked directly over and without hesitation embraced the older man. Colonel, I don't know how to thank you. When I called my wife to tell her I was safe, I told her about the voice that saved us all. Frank patted the younger man on the shoulder. You did the flying, son. You kept your head when everything went wrong. That's what saved your passengers. The crowd that had gathered passengers from the flight, airport personnel, media who had gotten wind of the story, began to applaud. The sound grew and grew until the entire terminal was filled with the thunder of appreciation. The next day, every major news outlet in America carried the story. 76-year-old hero pilot saves 186 lives from his garage was the headline in USA Today. CNN ran a special feature on Frank's military career. The Today Show wanted him for a live interview. Frank politely declined them all. The Federal Aviation Administration offered him a position as a senior emergency procedures consultant at $50,000 per month. Frank declined that too. I've got enough money, he told the FAA administrator who called personally. But if you want me to teach young people, I'll do that for free. Jessica had written a resignation letter and left it on her supervisor's desk. She was cleaning out her locker when she felt a tap on her shoulder. Frank stood there, still wearing the same simple clothes he'd had on the day before. "Don't quit, Miss Williams." "But Colonel, the way I treated you, the things I said, you made a mistake, but you learned from it. That makes you more valuable now, not less. Do you know what I did on my first day as an air traffic controller during my training?" Jessica shook her head. "I nearly caused a mid-air collision between two F-15s. My instructor could have washed me out of the program. Instead, he sat me down and said, 'Morrison, now you know what not to do. That makes you a better controller than you were this morning. I'm giving you the same chance he gave me.'" Tears ran down Jessica's cheeks. "Thank you, Colonel." 6 months later, Denver International Airport implemented the Morrison Protocol, a formal procedure requiring consultation with experienced retired pilots during unusual emergency situations. Frank came to the airport one day each week, teaching young controllers and sharing 4 decades of hard-won wisdom. The old garage remained his morning sanctuary, where he still listened to air traffic control frequencies over coffee. But now sometimes, young pilots would stop by. Word had gotten out somehow, and flight crews would detour through Colorado Springs just to meet the man who had become something of a legend. One autumn afternoon, Frank was in his garage when his 8-year-old grandson Tommy came running in, excited about something he'd seen on the internet. "Grandpa, are you really a hero? The kids at school saw a video about you." Frank smiled and lifted Tommy onto his lap. "What do you think makes someone a hero, kiddo?" Tommy thought seriously for a moment. "Saving people. That's part of it. But I think the real heroes are the people who listen, really listen to others. People who pay attention when someone needs help, even if that someone doesn't look important or talk loud. Is that why you saved those people on the airplane?" "I helped Tommy. But Captain Carter saved them by staying calm and following instructions. Miss Williams saved them by learning to listen. The real heroes are often the people you never hear about." Tommy nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Grandpa, I want to be a pilot like you." "Maybe you will, kiddo. But remember, the best pilot is the one who never stops learning, never stops listening, and never forgets that other people might know something worth hearing." As evening fell, Frank carried Tommy inside for dinner. A commercial airliner passed overhead, its navigation lights blinking against the darkening sky. Frank looked up and silently wished safe travels to the crew and passengers he'd never meet. In the terminal at Denver International Airport, Jessica Williams was handling the evening rush with calm efficiency. When a pilot called in with a minor hydraulic issue, she didn't immediately reach for her manual. Instead, she thought about what she'd learned, took a breath, and asked the right questions. The Morrison Protocol was working, but more importantly, the Morrison lesson that wisdom can come from unexpected places and that listening is sometimes the most heroic thing you can do, was spreading one conversation at a time. At Peterson Air Force Base, General Burke kept a photo on his desk of Frank Morrison receiving his Medal of Honor. Whenever young officers complained about old-timers who didn't understand modern procedures, Burke would point to that photo and tell them the story of the voice from the garage. And in a modest house in Colorado Springs, Frank Morrison settled into his favorite chair, opened a book, and enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, not just the emergency 6 months ago, but the daily job of passing on what he'd learned to those who would come after him. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the clear mountain sky, and somewhere above, pilots he'd never met were flying safely home. 3 years later, Captain James Carter was promoted to chief pilot at United Airlines. His first official act was to establish a mandatory training program where experienced retired pilots would mentor younger aviators. He called it the Morrison Initiative. Jessica Williams became one of Denver's most respected air traffic controllers and eventually a trainer herself. She kept a small plaque on her console that read, "Listen first." Frank Morrison continued his weekly visits to the airport until he was 82, teaching anyone who wanted to learn. His garage remained a pilgrimage site of sorts for young aviators, and his old radio continued to crackle with the voices of pilots navigating safely through challenging skies. The story became part of aviation lore, told and retold in flight schools and control towers around the world. But for those who lived it, the real lesson wasn't about emergency procedures or heroic rescues. It was about the simple, profound truth that wisdom doesn't always come with credentials, and sometimes the most important voice is the one you almost didn't listen to. In the end, Frank Morrison's greatest achievement wasn't the lives he saved that October morning. It was the culture of listening, learning and humility that grew from that moment when an old man in a garage decided that 186 strangers were worth the risk of speaking up. The voice from the garage had reminded everyone that in aviation, as in life, we're all in this together, and sometimes the person who can save the day is the one you least expect, sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for the moment when experience matters more than protocol.